The following segment is a mock debate produced for educational purposes only. The views expressed during the episode represent neither the official opinions of the Institute of International Relations and its researchers, nor the debate participants.
Hello everyone, you are hearing Podcast.IA, the podcast of the Center for Russia, Eurasia and Southeastern Europe of the Institute of International Relations. I am Stamatina Somaraki and I am welcoming everyone to the third episode of 2023.
With us, we have Pavlos Karagiannodimas.
Thank you very much for having me here.
Then, Theoni Griva.
Hello everyone, thank you again for the invitation.
Panagiota.
Thank you very much for the invitation.
Giannis, Ilkos.
Hello, thanks for the invitation.
And that brings us to the topic of today's podcast.
Can catastrophe bring peace? Could setting up a flood warning system bring enemy countries together? Could a regional earthquake building code set the groundwork for wider regional cooperation? Disaster diplomacy recognizes an opportunity to bring communities together who have a shared risk of disaster.
The evidence from disaster diplomacy studies suggest that disaster-related activities have the possibility for catalyzing diplomatic action. Disaster should not be desired, but attempts to extract as many positive aspects as possible from a difficult situation should be made, especially since those positive aspects can and should reduce vulnerability and contribute to disaster risk reduction. There are two different aspects of this kind of diplomacy. The first is that disaster diplomacy has long-term effects, and the second, that it only has short-term effects. We would like to reiterate that today's discussion is a mock debate, produced for educational purposes. The views which will be shared later do not represent the official opinion of the Institute of International Relations and researchers. Additionally, these views do not necessarily reflect the actual views of any of the debate participants. And now let us commence the debate with Theoni Griva.
Thank you very much, Klimis. First of all, we have to see that the disaster diplomacy is an evolving concept that broadly considers both the strategies for effective humanitarian action as well as the political consequences of those actions. It is concerned with the extent to which disaster-related activities, prevention, mitigation, response, and recovery induce cooperation between enemy parties, nationally or internationally. Disaster diplomacy is that disaster-related activities do not create new initiatives in achieving peace or reducing conflict, but it's a diplomatic process with pre-existing conditions which can be catalyzed or supported. All forms then of disaster-related activities have the potential to affect diplomacy, such as by spurring it on or by providing a space in which peace efforts can be more easily pursued.
Great point, Theoni. Now, let's hear a counter-argument from the other side, represented by Panagiota.
Thank you very much. The disaster diplomacy has only temporary results. It is a humanitarian obligation of each state to help another when the latter is affected by natural disasters or disasters caused by human intervention. A country's foreign policy has long-term objectives, which is why, even when it seems that two countries are getting closer, in the end, the dominant narrative that characterizes their bilateral relations reverts back. The long-term objectives of disaster diplomacy include a wide range of construction, financial support, and staff capacity. In many cases, states may not even be able to provide long-term support. That's why international organizations exist, as they have established and implemented the appropriate tools that provide relief to affected areas for a long time.
Thank you, Panagiota. for presenting such a compelling case. And now, Stamatina shall take over.
Thank you, Klimis. I think we are ready to start the second round. Giannis, it's your turn to present your arguments.
Thank you. So, the term disaster diplomacy describes the links between natural disasters and diplomatic relations of two respected countries. It is widely known that the international community responds to extreme natural disasters by sending humanitarian aid and support, as it is the case now with the devastated earthquakes that shook Turkey and Syria. Although it is highly questionable if a temporary humanitarian crisis can pave the ground for the improvement or even the rapprochement of two alienated nations. The baseline in this case of the disaster diplomacy is the time span. In the short run, humanitarian aid is provided in places where a natural disaster took place in order to alleviate the suffering of the damaged people. While these actions may contribute in the creation of bilateral networks, from civic society organizations to governmental authorities, the reason that brings them together is ephemeral, limited, and lasts only as long as humanitarian aid is needed. Long-term bilateral relations reflect a more complex mosaic, where variables like history, trade, and competition of different interests play a more crucial role. Disaster diplomacy is nothing more than an immediate response of the global civic society to a natural disaster. A quick and once-in-a-time reaction is not the sufficient ground for two political entities to come and discuss in depth and reapproach one another. Most importantly, it does not infuse mainstream politics with enough will and interests to change stable strategies and redraw the foreign policy of a country.
Thank you, Giannis, for the statement. Pavlos, you may continue.
Thank you very much. Now, disaster diplomacy can be the catalyst for two or more nations to reconsider or reevaluate their relations and negotiate with one another, leading to a peaceful resolution. This means that disaster diplomacy does not by itself magically fix the relations between two nations. Instead, what it does is that it becomes the first step in a ladder of succession and of then different actions that will lead to a more peaceful environment. But disaster diplomacy is the catalyst in many, many cases. Disaster diplomacy also affects the citizens at large. Specifically, it can change the way citizens of a country view the opposite side, making them more receptive to a government willing to negotiate rather than paint them as enemies, since their views will have changed to a more positive one, going against stereotypes. As we all know, in the world of international relations, we cannot have effective diplomacy, not only if the governments aren't cooperating with one another, but also if there is civil unrest and civil disobedience, since the populace of a nation does not agree with the diplomatic efforts that their country is chasing. My final argument is that disaster diplomacy doesn't happen only after a disaster, but many times it's before one arises. Usually, this happens by signing agreements between nations that allow and facilitate the cooperation of national agencies, like firefighting services, to coordinate efforts in order to protect common interests. This can be a stepping stone for further negotiations and agreements between the two nations, since security from natural disasters is an issue where there are no opposing sides. We have seen a wonderful example of this, especially in the Balkans, with many multilateral agreements between Greece and other neighboring nations, whom in the past have had troubling relations with our country. Thank you very much.
Your statements were very interesting. Our second round is over, and I will give the reins to Klimis.
Thank you for the wonderful argumentation, everybody. Now, we're going onward to the third round, where each side will analyze and refute the points put forward by the opposite side. Now, let us hear from Theoni Griva and Pavlos Karagiannodimas.
Thank you very much again, Klimis. An aspect of disaster diplomacy we can examine more thoroughly is the health crisis. A really characteristic example are the relations between China and Africa as far as for the public health sector. Global public health has always been a key element of China's foreign policy, especially in Africa. China dispatched its first Chinese medical teams to Africa since 1961 and has since deployed over 20,000 civilian and military CMTs to 51 countries. Nowadays, the COVID-19 pandemic has created new opportunities for China to cement its engagements in Africa. Chinese diplomats have cast Beijing's medical assistance as an example of friendship, sincerity, and above all, solidarity. At least 30 African nations sent financial and material assistance to China, initiatives that largely went unnoticed. This support included 10 tons of medicine from Egypt, $2 million from Equatorial Guinea, a plane load of aid from Algeria, and all this is dispelling the misconception that African actors lack agency in their dealings with China. Cast in this light, China's role is partly focused on reciprocating these acts of goodwill from Africa, another popular talking point. And now to my colleague Pavlos.
Thank you very much, Theoni. Now, it is important to note that Africa was the only region that Chinese President Xi Jinping dwelt on when he addressed the 73rd World Health Assembly in May of 2020. He announced a $2 billion commitment for the WHO, the World Health Organization's COVID-19 response, which he said specifically, especially in developing countries. In June, he pledged more pandemic-related support to Africa at the China-Africa Summit on solidarity against COVID-19. This included debt relief, equipment, vaccines, education and training, and technical expertise. However, China's message of solidarity is not without problems. In March of 2020, numerous videos of Africans being evicted, blocked from hotels, and refused entry into restaurants emerged during a resurgence of COVID-19 in Jiangsu. This created African outrage and relations stalled, but have seemed now to be better.
Thank you, Theoni and Pavlos, for this passionate argument. Now, let us hear from the opposite side.
Thank you very much. It is a very interesting case from the other team, but there is another option. In 1999, Greece and Turkey were affected by devastating earthquakes. Both countries sent humanitarian aid to each other, but the impact has short-term effects, because from that period, the two countries have had disputes over Aegean Sea for decades, which are growing in intensity continuously. So the political figures have a major role. And to my colleague, Giannis.
Thank you, Panagiota. I would like also to add that disaster diplomacy and humanitarian aid should be interpreted as a means of economic diplomacy of the wealthier countries. And this argument is demonstrated by the fact that the countries of the global north are the ones that contribute the most in the humanitarian missions and provide material and financial supports to ones in need. Although it is remarkable that even the global south is the one that is more impacted from the climate crisis that we are living now, the global north is responding more to disasters that are happening to its region and in general in wealthier countries. So it is to say that humanitarian aid and support is provided in order to construct relations with countries that they share some political interests rather than coming to help one another in terms of solidarity. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody. And that concludes the third part of this debate. All the arguments have been very insightful, and thank you for sharing them with us. And now, my co-host will continue.
We have just reached the end of this episode. I would like to thank Klimis Katsiavrias for co-hosting with me.
Thank you, Stamatina. I appreciate that.
As well as today's participants, Pavlos Karagiannodimas.
Thank you once again for the invitation and the wonderful argumentation.
Theoni Griva.
Thank you very much again. Thank you, Stamatina and Klimis, and all colleagues for this wonderful conversation.
Panagiota Chatzilymperi.
Thank you very much. It was a very interesting discussion, and I hope the people know better about the issue of disaster diplomacy.
And Giannis Ilkos.
Thank you very much for the invitation.
I hope everybody in the audience enjoyed this podcast and learned anything. Tune in on the next episode of Podcast.IA.